How many middle-aged people out there, TV land? How many of you in the AARP? Hopefully you've worked hard in your career and you've saved a little bit. You haven't been too profligate. You didn't treat your home like an ATM. Middle-aged people arguably have more money and they're more likely to invest. That goes the anecdote because they're more experienced and savvy, been around, done that, been there. Also more likely to take some bigger risk with their cash as well. Younger kids, we're talking like Y-Gen here, less money. Even if they do have a little money, they're more likely to sort of squander it away on stupid things like education and beer. So if you're an investment manager, you might do well to watch the ratio of middle-agers to youngsters, or what our next guest calls the Demi-Ashton ratio. Ajay Kapoor is the Chief Global Investment Officer at Mirae. I've got to get my Korean right. Asset Securities. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you, Bernie.
Are you Y-Gen or are you X or T-Gen like me?
A man never talks about his age, or is that women? I don't know.
That's women. Well, anyway, let's not talk about that.
Okay.
Demi-Ashton, what are we talking about here?
Right. Well, as you explained it very well, the interesting thing is that middle-aged folks have quite a bit of money that they've saved, and they have a pretty good appetite for risk because they're worried about their impending retirement in 20 years, and so they tend to buy more of equities with their financial wealth. Whereas young people will A, they don't have very much money, and B, they use their funds for education, for beer.
Humbug.
And so in countries that have a lot of people in their 40s, and shall we call them the middle-aged people, versus very young people, which are in their 20s, those countries tend to see their equity markets go up dramatically. So Japan in the 1980s, the US in the 1990s, and lots of Asia in the last 8 or 10 years. And so it's called the middle-young ratio, but I call it the Demi-Ashton ratio for obvious reasons.
Yeah. Did you coin this?
I did.
You did?
I coined the Demi-Ashton ratio because Demi Moore is in her 40s, and her husband, Ashton Kutcher, is borderline young.
Okay, and you patented this?
No, I haven't.
You didn't. But you referred to Japan in the 80s, though. That didn't. Then what happened is Japan got older and older, and you had fewer and fewer people working versus the number of people who aren't working, and it became a socialist society. No, that's too strong a word, but you get my drift here.
Well, I think demography is destiny, especially for equity markets. And so while a lot of us spend a lot of time with monetary policy and valuations and all that important stuff, over the long haul, 5 to 10 years, it really is demography that drives real equity returns. And to your question, in Japan in 1990 till 2000 or so, the middle-young ratio, the Demi-Ashton ratio, just collapsed quite strongly. But going forward, it's looking pretty good. And so don't look at aging. In other words, you got to focus precisely on the number of people in their 40s divided by the number of people in their 20s to make a market call.
And is this consistent across demographies? I mean, this is proven. I mean, you tested it and tested it and tested it and tested it again and ran it through.
I tortured it till it confessed. And if you...
You waterboarded it.
Yes, I did. Well, if you look at this ratio for the U.S., for most Western European countries, for Japan, it's pretty much for most developed markets, going back till 1950, it works, and it works beautifully. And so the interesting thing about Japan in the 80s, you might be thinking, well, hey, their fundamentals were great in the 1980s. I look back, and their return on equity was, guess how much? Through the 80s, 7%. The U.S. does that in a recession year. So in other words, the Japanese ROE wasn't fantabulous. It was simply the middle-young ratio, this demand for equities and risk that was just coursing through the system that took equities up and then down.
Okay. Let me put that. Ray, have you been listening to my chat with Ajay? Do you buy this Demi-Ashton ratio? Do you like what you're hearing so far? Can it jive at all with what you do?
Well, it doesn't jive with what I do, but it's certainly, I have heard, I mean, it's very similar to Harry Dent's idea about demography, and I think it's a valid theory. It's just that it's something I don't use.
And you don't use it because, presumably, you've been doing this a long time, too. You've kicked it and stress tested and waterboarded it and tortured it and then prodded it, and it didn't work? Or it's just not, it's a different culture for you than yours?
Yeah, remember I said to you that for me technical analysis is a psychological tool, and my tools have to suit my personality. It's just a tool that doesn't suit my personality, so I kicked it.
Okay, fair enough.
No,
I mean,
it does work.
That's the nice. That's a nice thing about choice is when you have it, you have it. When you don't have it, you really miss it. A lot of the conclusions that Ray and I were talking about in the first half of the program do dovetail with what you're talking about. Let's take the top-down approach. We'll get back to Eastern Europe and the Balkans and that sort of thing. But you think that the trajectory is intact and that the S&P can revisit like 1,250, that territory, by next March. That is actually quite in sync with what Ray was telling me.
Right. Well, I've been maximum bullish for a few months now. In fact, crazy maximum bullish. And the rationale was pretty straightforward, that I thought that valuations were pretty compelling. I think they're still okay. They're not great anymore. But very importantly, monetary policy is very easy. And all the technicals that I look at, I don't know what Ray is looking at, but I look at the number of new lows. They've almost vanished. I also look at market breadth. It's very, very strong. I look at the COPOC indicators. A whole host of technicals also pretty good. And most importantly, the economic recovery in Asia, ex-Japan, and the U.S. is going to be stunningly positive by the end of the year. And I'd say meeting clients around the world, they just don't believe that at all.
So what kind of we were discussing alpha curves, V's versus W's, and we're hearing from people like Abby Joseph Cohen a little bit. Do we have any conclusions on where we are in the cycle? I mean, are we safe, or was yesterday or earlier today in New York, was that a knee-jerk sort of a one-off flash in the pan, kind of a one-off event, or
yes,
or
I think it's like Usain Bolt, that even the man has to take a breather after his sprint. So it's exactly the same thing. But I think we're in reasonably good shape. We're in a very powerful cyclical bull market that should go on, if history is a guide, till the end of this year, till early next year. And we've had an extreme event, and I've looked at past extreme events in the U.S., so-called waterfall declines, and you fall a lot. And I've seen, assuming that early March was the low, what is the trajectory of the market following that waterfall decline? You tend to, within 2 years off that low, make up almost all your money back.
All right. I like maximum bulls because it makes it fun to try target practice with a high-powered air rifle.